The thing about Star Wars is that it has always been two things at once. There is the thing most of us grew up with, the most beloved science fiction franchise in cinema history, the kind of property parents press into their children's hands, like a rite of passage, full of people in funny outfits swinging beams of coloured light at each other, across impossibly beautiful alien worlds. The opening crawl. John Williams doing what only John Williams does. The moment Darth Vader first fills a doorway, and everyone who has ever seen it feels something shift slightly in their chest. It is genuinely wonderful, that franchise, taken on its own terms. And then there is the other thing, the layer underneath, where the fandom has spent the better part of 5 decades in a state of highly productive, extremely energetic argument, with each other, with the filmmakers, with critics, and occasionally with George Lucas himself, about what all of it means, what should have been different, and who exactly has the authority to make those calls. It has produced some truly extraordinary moments. A beloved character, quietly re-edited 4 separate times until nobody could agree on what happened in a cantina scene that lasts about 30 seconds. A fan theory about the most universally despised character in the saga that turned out to be partially true, confirmed years later by one of the people who made the films. A holiday television special so catastrophically strange that the man who created the franchise once said he wanted to track down every surviving copy with a sledgehammer. And a sequel trilogy that somehow managed to make both the fans a right to be critical, and some of these fans are genuinely behaving very badly. Simultaneously, accurate descriptions of the same ongoing situation. Tonight we are going to go through all of it, slowly and without any particular urgency, the way you might talk someone through something interesting at 1 a.m. when neither of you has anywhere to be. We will follow things in roughly the order they happened, starting in 1978 and drifting forward through 40-odd years of passionate, sometimes exhausting, occasionally wonderful film fandom. Some of what we cover is confirmed history. Some of it is theory, which I will always say clearly when we get there, and some of it lives in that particular Star Wars zone where the official version and what actually seems to have happened are two slightly different things, and everyone involved remembers it rather differently. There is no climax coming. I should say up front. No big reveal at the end that everything has secretly been building toward. This is more of a long, comfortable drift through a subject I find genuinely fascinating. The gap between what a story means to the people who made it and what it means to the people who grew up with it. If you happen to fall asleep somewhere around the section on midi-chlorians, I will take that as a sign that you are a very sensible person. A few things before we properly begin. Some of what is here is very well documented, reported by journalists, confirmed by multiple people who were present, available in biographies and interviews, and DVD commentaries. Some of it is theory, which I will always flag as such, and some of it sits in that particular Star Wars zone where what actually happened and what the official record says happened are two slightly different things. I will always say which is which, though I should acknowledge that in a franchise where the creator has revised his own films 4 times and publicly contradicted himself about the original intentions on multiple occasions, the word official does some unusual work. I am also not here to tell you what to think. Whether George Lucas had the right to keep editing A New Hope, whether The Last Jedi is a brilliant subversion or a failure of nerve, whether the Disney era has been good for Star Wars overall, these are questions where reasonable people hold different views, and I find most of the most interesting things about this franchise live exactly in the space between those views. Tonight I am just going to lay it all out and let you decide what to make of it, and then let you settle into sleep with something interesting to turn over in the back of your mind. If you are new here and this kind of long, quiet, nerdy storytelling about pop culture history sounds like your thing, please do subscribe. It helps enormously. But now, Let us start at the very beginning, which in the case of Star Wars is not actually the first film. It is something considerably stranger than that. The Star Wars Holiday Special aired once on a Friday evening in November 1978 on CBS. It drew around 13 million viewers, and then it was never broadcast again. Not once in nearly 50 years. George Lucas has never officially released it in any format, and the reasons for that, once you have actually sat with the thing, become quite clear within about the first 15 minutes. Let me explain what it even is, because there is a fair chance that if you are under 40, you have only ever heard about it the way people describe myths, a creature that technically exists somewhere, but that nobody has ever actually seen with their own eyes. And then you find it on the internet, because it is absolutely on the internet, and you realise it is somehow even stranger than described. The premise is reasonable enough, at least on paper. It is 1978, just over a year after A New Hope came out and became the highest grossing film in history. Star Wars is absolutely everywhere. The toys, the lunchboxes, the bedroom posters, the cereal boxes. CBS approached Lucasfilm about doing a variety special to capitalise on all of this ahead of the Thanksgiving holiday, and someone said yes. Now, variety shows were a significant part of American television at the time. Big, glossy, multi-act entertainment spectacles with celebrity guests and musical numbers and comedy sketches. In theory, a Star Wars variety show sounds like an idea that could make commercial sense. In practice, the thing that came out was one of the most genuinely surreal 2 hours of television ever broadcast on a major American network. The plot, such as it is, concerns Chewbacca trying to get home to the Wookiee planet of Kashyyyk in time for Life Day, which the special presents as a kind of cosmic Thanksgiving crossed with Christmas. Along the way, we meet Chewbacca's family, his wife, Malla, his son, Lumpy, and his father, and I want you to know that this is the character's actual official name, Itchy. The opening 10 minutes of the special is essentially just these three Wookiees grunting at each other, completely untranslated, in what I can only describe as a performance space that looks like someone ordered everything from a particularly bold 1970s interior design catalogue. And then the celebrity guests arrive. Bea Arthur, who played the cantina's bartender, later said she agreed to be in it because her youngest child was a die-hard Star Wars fan, which is a rather touching reason to end up in something this peculiar. Art Carney turns up as a roving space trader. Harvey Korman plays multiple roles, one of which involves him appearing as a four-armed alien chef presenting a cookery program that Chewbacca's wife watches while she waits for her husband to arrive home. Jefferson Starship, the rock band, not any variety of actual spacecraft, perform a song that cannot be described as anything other than deeply of its moment. None of it is good. I want to be fair here. Some of it is so strange that it crosses over into a kind of hypnotic watchability, which is probably why it has become such an enduring piece of Star Wars folklore. But the charitable version of events is that it is a fascinating cultural artifact. The less charitable version is that it is a rather unfortunate way to spend 2 hours. The one genuinely praised element is an 11-minute animated segment produced by the Canadian studio Nelvana, whose style Lucas specifically admired. And that segment matters in a way that nobody at the time would have predicted, because it contains the very first appearance of Boba Fett, the bounty hunter in Mandalore, who would go on to have a long and complicated relationship with the franchise. He shows up here years before The Empire Strikes Back, riding a dinosaur-like creature and introducing himself to Luke Skywalker in a cartoon that plays like a rather dark adventure story. For fans who discover it later, finding Boba Fett's debut buried inside the holiday special feels a bit like finding a very good painting stacked against the wall at a jumble sale. Lucas's involvement with the rest of the production was minimal. He had a story credit, but the actual variety show mechanics were handled by television writers and producers who were very good at what they did within their specific medium, but who were, in a fundamental way, not making the same thing Lucas was making. He later described the whole experience with a remarkable diplomatic precision, saying they had let them use the characters, and that probably wasn't the smartest thing to do, but you learn from those experiences. The cast took a similar view. Harrison Ford could barely bring himself to acknowledge its existence when asked about it on a late-night chat show years later. Carrie Fisher, in what is perhaps my favourite Star Wars anecdote of all time, once said she had been given a copy of the special on the condition that she would use it at parties when she wanted everyone to leave. The special was never rebroadcast, and Lucas refused to release it on any home video format. It has survived entirely through fan recordings made on domestic video equipment in 1978, subsequently copied and shared and eventually uploaded to the internet, where it now exists in perpetuity, regardless of what anyone thinks about sledgehammers. For what it is worth, the Nelvana animation segment has aged surprisingly well. It has a visual style that is genuinely distinctive, slightly psychedelic, more interested in atmosphere than action, and there is something about the design of the alien landscapes and creatures that feels more imaginative than a lot of the actual merchandising from the same period. The sequence in which Boba Fett is introduced as apparently helpful and then revealed to be duplicitous tells you immediately what kind of character he is in a more efficient way than the films eventually managed. Several Star Wars fans who watched the holiday special specifically to see the segment have said that, taken in isolation, it is actually quite good, which is a strange sentence to be able to write about something embedded in the holiday special, but there it is. One more piece of context worth having. The special was broadcast on the 17th of November, 1978, the same date that, 42 years later, Disney deliberately chose to premiere the Man Du Lo I Un's second season. Whether that was a knowing nod to the original special or pure coincidence depends on who you ask. Either way, it is the kind of detail that the internet decided was deliberate and affectionate, and I am not inclined to argue. What is interesting about it, sitting here decades later, is what it tells you about where Star Wars was in 1978. The franchise was so new and so enormous simultaneously that nobody had yet worked out what it could and could not survive. The thing that makes Star Wars work is quite specific and in some ways quite fragile, the sense of a lived-in universe with its own internal logic and mythology, and it took seeing it handled this badly for everyone involved to understand that. Which is, I suppose, a fairly expensive way to learn something, but Star Wars has never been shy about expensive lessons. There is one more layer to the holiday special worth mentioning, and it is this. Despite Lucas's best efforts, the special maintained a kind of canonical status within Lucasfilm's internal record-keeping for decades. A Lucasfilm archivist responsible for tracking continuity confirmed in 2007 that the Holocron, their internal continuity database, contained at least 28 entries relating to the holiday special. Characters like Chewbacca's family, Malla and Lumpy, and concepts like Life Day were logged as part of the secondary continuity tier, meaning they existed in the Star Wars universe but could be overridden by any other licensed material. It is, in a sense, the most politely buried piece of official Star Wars canon ever produced. Not erased, not celebrated, just quietly filed. The special was brought into slightly sharper focus when a Lego animated film in 2020, released deliberately on the same date as the original, the 17th of November, used Chewbacca's family and the Life Day concept as its central premise, treating the original special with the kind of affectionate, self-aware humour that I think is probably the only sensible way to approach it. That Lego special was actually rather good, which is a sentence that feels mildly surreal to type. One last detail that belongs here. Harrison Ford, when asked about the holiday special on a late-night program years after its broadcast, paused for a very long time before responding. He then said flatly, "I have a memory of that," and then he declined to elaborate, which is, in its way, a more complete review than most critics managed to write in 1978. Somewhere in early 1997, audiences going to see the special edition re-release of A New Hope found that a scene they had watched dozens of times had been quietly changed. Han Solo still sat down across from the bounty hunter Greedo in the Mos Eisley cantina. The conversation still happened, and then, in the new version, Greedo fired his blaster first, from point-blank range, apparently missing Han's head by a comfortable margin, before Han returned fire and killed him. Fans were not, to put it gently, thrilled about this. The original cantina scene, as it appeared in the 1977 theatrical cut, is a morally interesting piece of filmmaking. Han Solo is a smuggler, a scoundrel, someone who owes money to people you would rather not owe money to. And when Greedo sits down across from him and explains in some detail that he has been looking forward to this moment, Han reaches under the table, gets his blaster ready, and shoots first without giving Greedo a chance to act. It is cold. It is efficient. It tells you immediately and clearly what kind of person Han Solo is. Someone who survives by making hard calls before his opponents can. Crucially, it makes his eventual transformation into a hero of the rebellion actually mean something. You are watching a man change over the course of 3 films, and the change feels earned because you saw clearly what he was at the start. George Lucas changed the scene because he did not want Han to read as a cold-blooded killer. He wanted the self-defense interpretation to be unambiguous, and from a purely mythological standpoint, the reasoning has some internal logic to it. If Han was always capable of heroism, where did the ruthlessness that needed redeeming actually come from? The problem, which fans identified almost immediately, is that the change asks the audience to accept that a trained bounty hunter, seated 2 feet away from his target in a quiet booth, missed. The CGI used to depict Han dodging the shot, a slightly jerky movement of his head, did not help matters. It looked artificial, and it felt wrong, and almost no one who had seen the original thought it was an improvement. So the edit went in, the backlash was immediate and sustained, and Han shot first became a phrase that meant more than its 3 words. It became shorthand for a whole set of anxieties about the relationship between a creative work and the person who made it, about whether someone can keep going back and altering something that has become part of millions of people's personal histories. And then Lucas kept changing it. For the 2004 DVD release, the timing was adjusted so that Greedo and Han fired at almost exactly the same moment. For the 2011 Blu-ray, a few more frames were trimmed to tighten the exchange. And then, when A New Hope arrived on Disney Plus in November 2019, one more change appeared. Greedo now says a word, McClunky, before the guns come out. The word is unsubtitled. Nobody is certain what it means in Huttese. The actor who originally played Greedo, Paul Blake, confirmed it was not in the original dialogue. What is rather interesting about that last change is that it was actually made by Lucas himself, before the sale to Disney, as part of a planned 3D re-release of the original trilogy that never ended up happening. Disney did not add it. Lucas, who had by then sold the franchise, was still adjusting it on the way out the door. His explanation across all of this remained consistent. He said in 2004 that the original cut doesn't really exist anymore in his mind. He described the special editions as the films he always wanted to make. In 2015, he offered the most complete version of his reasoning, that Han was always supposed to be the John Wayne type, someone who lets the other man shoot first, which is a coherent artistic position, even if it is also one that required the other man to miss from 2 feet away. There is an amusing detail hiding in all of this, incidentally. In the original scene, the single bolt Han fires clearly goes through his table. there is a visible scorch hole in the tabletop when Greedo falls. In the 1997 and subsequent versions, Han fires 2 bolts, neither of which visibly passes through the table. But the hole is still there when Greedo falls. Nobody fixed this through any of the 4 subsequent edits. The table quietly tells the original story every time. Fan restoration projects have existed since the early 2000s to address exactly this kind of thing. The most comprehensive, Harmy's Despecialized Edition, used laserdisc scans and film elements to reconstruct something close to how the 1977 version of the film looked and sounded. It is not official. It is entirely a fan production, and it exists because people cared enough to spend years making it, which I think says something rather definitive about where the Han shot first debate actually lands for most people who care about it. Lucas, for his part, has described his approach to revising the films as analogous to a painter continuing to work on a canvas. The painting is never truly finished. In his view, it is simply released to the world at a particular point in time, and the artist retains the right to keep refining it. This is a coherent artistic philosophy, and it has genuine precedent in the visual arts. The problem, which many people have pointed out, is that a painting is a singular object. When a film changes and then replaces its predecessor, when the version that the audience grew up with becomes unavailable, the relationship between artist and work becomes something different from a painter going back to just a canvas that still exists somewhere. The original 1977 theatrical cut of A New Hope has never been officially released in a high-definition format. The closest you can get to watching it the way audiences did in 1977 is either the 2006 DVD release, which included a non-anamorphic laserdisc transfer of the original version as a bonus disc, technically available but not well preserved, or one of the fan restoration projects. For a film that is widely considered one of the most important in cinema history, that is a strange situation to find yourself in. And it is directly because of the Han shot first debate and everything it represents. An impasse between a creator who believes he has the right to determine the definitive version of his work, and an audience that believes the version they fell in love with deserves to exist independently. Neither side is entirely wrong, and neither side has ever quite convinced the other. That tension between a creator's right to keep revising and an audience's stake in the version they grew up with turns out to run through a lot of bigger arguments about art and ownership that go well beyond any cantina scene. Here is something that has always struck me as genuinely extraordinary about The Empire Strikes Back. The most celebrated twist in cinema history, the moment when Darth Vader tells Luke Skywalker that he is his father, may not have been part of the plan for any significant portion of the original trilogy's development. It may, according to some of the most credible accounts available, have originated at a dinner party. As an offhand joke, George Lucas has long suggested he had the whole thing mapped out from the beginning. There has been considerable emphasis over the years on the concept of a grand design, 9 films sketched out in advance, the Skywalker saga as a single cohesive vision that Lucas was patiently working through. Elements of that are true. The mythology was always there, the Force, the chosen one, good and evil as facets of the same family. But the specific detail that Darth Vader was Luke's father is a rather different matter. The clearest evidence comes from the first screenplay written for The Empire Strikes Back. Lucas hired a writer called Lee Brackett to write the first draft in 1977, working from his story notes. Brackett was a remarkable person, incidentally, a veteran Hollywood screenwriter who had co-written The Big Sleep alongside William Faulkner, and before that, a genuine giant of science fiction literature who had mentored the young Ray Bradbury. She was an excellent and serious choice for the job. In Brackett's version of the script, Darth Vader is not Luke's father. They're 2 separate people. On the swampy planet she called Bog World, which became Dag-Obar in the finished film, Luke is trained by an old Jedi Master, and also meets the Force ghost of his father, Anakin Skywalker. They have a real conversation. Anakin tells Luke he is proud of him. He mentions that Luke has a twin sister, and when the confrontation with Vader comes, Vader's taunt is that Luke cannot hope to defeat him, any more than his father could. Two different people. Brackett died of cancer in March 1978, not long after delivering her draft. Lucas then wrote the second draft himself, and it was here that the father twist appeared for the first time. Lawrence Kasdan came in afterwards to polish it further, and only Lucas, the director Irvin Kershner, and Mark Hamill knew the real line during filming. The actor playing Vader's body on set, David Prowse, was given a false version. Obi-Wan killed your father. The rest of the cast, including Carrie Fisher, found out at the premiere, or close to it. Now, the origin story of the twist itself is where things get genuinely wonderful. Marcia Lucas, who was George's wife and editor during this period, and who made enormous creative contributions to all three original films, described in a 2022 documentary what appears to have been the actual moment of the idea. George was struggling with the third act structure for Empire and trying to find something that would land with real weight. He had screenwriting friends over for dinner one evening, Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, who had previously worked with Lucas on other projects. And during the evening, Huyck made an offhand quip. "You can always make Darth Vader Luke's father." Marcia recalled it vividly. "I kid you not," she said. "I don't know if Willard even remembers saying that." It was, by any reasonable reading, a joke, but it stuck. And Lucas, working on his second draft in the following months, made it the emotional centre of the entire film, and retroactively turned the whole saga into something considerably more personal than it had previously been. There is also a piece of mythology worth addressing here, because it comes up in discussions about how much was planned. The claim that Darth Vader is German for Dark Father is sometimes cited as evidence that Lucas had the twist in mind from 1977 and even encoded it in the character's name. It is a satisfying idea. It is also not quite accurate. The German for father is Vater, not Vader, and in Dutch Vader does actually mean father, which is interesting but somewhat different. The name came first and the meaning was found later, or constructed to fit. None of which diminishes how well the twist works, of course. It remains one of the great revelations in popular cinema, and the fact that it was apparently discovered during the writing process rather than planned from the start is, if anything, a testament to how good improvised storytelling can be when the underlying instincts are sound. Lucas's core feeling that the story should be about family, about a father and son, about the possibility of redemption even from the deepest darkness, was present early. The specific mechanic of how to get there came later, which is, when you think about it, how most good stories actually develop. Hamill, for his part, has described his reaction to receiving the real line in remarkable detail in interviews over the years. Kershner sat him down separately, in private, before the scene, and told him what Vader was actually going to say. Hamill's response was apparently to ask, with complete sincerity, whether the other actors knew. Kershner said no, and Hamill then had to go and shoot the scene carrying information that almost nobody else on the production had. The famous anguish, the disbelief, it was in some real sense genuine. He was playing a character confronting an impossible truth that the actor himself had only just been told. The twist also changed what mainstream blockbuster cinema could attempt in ways that are still felt. Before The Empire Strikes Back, the assumption about adventure films was that the protagonist's journey was largely self-contained, that what you needed to know about the hero was laid out in the first film, and the rest was consequence. The Vader reveal made the entire backstory of the first film retroactively richer and more tragic. It made Obi-Wan's careful description of Vader, seduced by the dark side, means something considerably more specific. And it made A New Hope, a film audiences had already seen dozens of times, into the opening chapter of something far more complex than it had previously appeared to be. The fact that audiences accepted this retroactive reframing so completely and so immediately says something important about how much trust Lucas had built with the first film. You cannot pull off a twist like that without goodwill already in the bank. In 1999, in the opening act of The Phantom Menace, Jade Eye Master, Qui-Gon Jinn takes a blood sample from a young boy named Anakin Skywalker, ostensibly to check for infections, and sends it to his Padawan Obi-Wan for analysis. Obi-Wan's response, quiet and measured, is that the readings are off the chart. A count over 20,000, higher than Master Yoda's, and then Qui-Gon explains what this means. The Force, he says, speaks to us through living creatures called midi-chlorians, microscopic life forms that reside in all living cells. The more of them you have, the stronger your potential connection to the Force, and Anakin has more than anyone in recorded JDI history. A significant portion of the audience was not happy about this. The complaint was specific and, in fairness, understandable. The Force, as it had been presented in the original trilogy, was something mystical and unquantifiable. Obi-Wan described it to Luke as an energy field created by all living things that binds the galaxy together. Essentially, a spiritual concept, something you could feel and trust and reach for, but not measure. Introducing a microscopic biological explanation, the argument went, turn the Force from something numinous into something genetic. It implied that a Jedi's power was in their blood in a quite literal, measurable sense. It made Force sensitivity less like spiritual attunement and more like a talent you either inherited or didn't. There is also an interesting secondary critique that did not get nearly as much attention at the time, but that I think is actually rather sharp. If your potential connection to the Force can be read in your blood, and if the Jedi Order routinely tests children for it and recruits those with high counts, then the Order is running something that looks a lot like biological selection, which casts the GDI in a slightly uncomfortable light, less like a group of wise scholars and more like an institution that identifies children who fit a genetic profile and trains them into its own image. That reading has interesting implications for the prequel trilogy's quiet critique of Jedi institutional arrogance, even if it was not the reading most people led with in 1999. Lucas's own explanation was that the concept had existed in some form in his thinking since the very earliest days of Star Wars, referenced vaguely in notes going back to 1976, and that the films had simply never had room to include it before. In the DVD commentary for The Phantom Menace, he said the scene existed to give Anakin significance, a measurable, concrete quality that even the most skeptical member of the JDI Council could not dismiss. He also clarified something that is worth holding on to, because the initial criticism often skipped past it. Qui-Gon is not saying that midi-chlorians are the Force. He is saying they are the mechanism through which a living being can perceive the Force and be perceived by it, a biological interface between the physical world and something that exists entirely beyond it. The Force in this reading still has its own will, its own direction. The midi-chlorians are simply how it talks to you and how well you can hear it. Whether that distinction makes the concept feel less deflating is genuinely a matter of personal response. Some people feel that any scientific-sounding explanation for something mysterious removes the mystery. Others think explaining the mechanism for how a thing works does not diminish what it is. Both positions are reasonable, and I do not think there is a tidy answer. What I will say is that midi-chlorians kept mattering in the larger Star Wars universe, in ways that eventually gave the concept more depth than it had in that one film. The Clone Wars animated series used them to explore the distinction between the living force and the cosmic force. The difference between the force as it manifests in individual living beings and the force as a larger universal presence. Yoda, in the later seasons, goes on a genuinely strange and beautiful journey to understand how a being can retain consciousness after death, and midi-chlorians are central to how that is possible. It ends up being a rather more sophisticated piece of mythology than the blood test scene in The Phantom Menace suggested. That Clone Wars arc, for anyone who has not seen it, is worth describing a little. Yoda hears the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, a voice that cannot exist because the Jedi do not believe consciousness survives death, and travels to a planet called the Wellspring of Life, which appears to be the origin point for midi-chlorians themselves. What he encounters there is not a simple explanation. It is closer to a spiritual experience, a confrontation with the nature of the Force at its most fundamental level, and an understanding of how the living and cosmic aspects of the Force interact. The midi-chlorians in this account are not a debunking of the mystical Force. They are the bridge between the mystical and the biological, the mechanism through which the infinite speaks to the finite. Whether that retroactively makes the blood test scene in The Phantom Menace feel like less of a wrong turn is up to the individual viewer. But it does suggest that Lucas had something considerably more ambitious in mind for the concept than the film had space to develop. And then the Man Duo Law Eun brought them back into mainstream conversation with the whole question of what various parties want with Grogu's biology and what extraordinary things his particular level of Force sensitivity might enable. The most mocked concept in the prequel trilogy ended up being quietly foundational to the franchise's Disney Plus era, which I find rather satisfying in a complicated way. Building gently on what we just talked about, and I promise this is the last stretch of prequel mythology before we get to something considerably more ridiculous. There is a question that The Phantom Menace raises and never entirely answers, which fans and theorists have been quietly circling ever since. Shmi Skywalker, when asked about Anakin's father, says simply that there was no father. She does not know how to explain it. He was conceived, and there was no father, and that is all she knows. The film presents this as something cosmic and chosen, Anakin as the chosen one, born of the Force itself, destined to bring balance. Qui-Gon connects it to the prophecy immediately, and then the films largely move on, without returning to the specific mechanics of how exactly this happened. Except that in Revenge of the Sith, Pal Poutine tells Anakin a story. He describes his old master, Darth Plagueis the Wise, a Sith Lord so devoted to unlocking the deepest secrets of the dark side that he had learned to use the Force to influence the building blocks of life, to create life, to prevent death. The scene is extraordinary, sitting slightly outside the rest of the film's energy. Ian McDiarmid and Hayden Christensen at a glittering, dimly lit space opera, while Pal Poutine calmly offers Anakin everything he has ever desperately wanted. It is one of the best scenes in the prequel trilogy, I think, and it does something very clever. It puts an explanation for Anakin's origin in the film without quite committing to it. The suggestion, placed carefully enough that it works whether you take it literally or not, is that Plagueis' experiments with life and the stuff we talked about in the last section may have had an unintended consequence. That the Sith, in tampering with the natural order of things, triggered a response from the Force itself. The Force created Anakin as a correction, the Chosen One as the galaxy's immune response to what the Sith had done to it. There is a rough draft of the Revenge of the Sith script that made this considerably more explicit. In that version, Pal Poutine essentially tells Anakin directly that he, or rather his experiments, caused Anakin's conception, and says something to the effect of, "You could almost think of me as your father." Lucas cut this. The finished film leaves the question open. Pal Poutine tells the story of what Plagueis could do, and does not explicitly claim responsibility. Whether that ambiguity is a deliberate artistic choice, or a late decision to pull back from something too strange, nobody has said definitively. The most comprehensive treatment of the idea in the former expanded universe came in James Luceno's 2012 novel Darth Plagueis, which offered an elegant solution. In that version, Plagueis and his apprentice Sidious had been conducting experiments for years to push the boundary between life and death, pushing hard enough that the midi-chlorians themselves, effectively reacting to the disturbance, created Anakin in Shmi Skywalker without any second parent. Not Plagueis creating Anakin on purpose, the Force or the biological building blocks through which it operates, essentially recoiling from what the Sith were doing and generating a counterweight. Anakin as a cosmic correction rather than a Sith plot. So in that reading, Anakin had one parent, Shmi, but the circumstances of his existence were the unintended result of Sith interference with the nature of things, which makes the prophecy simultaneously more poetic and considerably darker than it first appears. The Chosen One was created by the darkness he was born to destroy. Lucas, in a later interview for an archival book, did offer his own final word on the matter, that Anakin was created by the will of the Force and that the story Palpatine told about Plagueis' power was a lie, something constructed to entice Anakin, not a truthful account of events, which either settles it cleanly or adds another layer, depending on how much weight you give to an author's retrospective statements about a question the films deliberately kept open. What I find most interesting about this whole thread, sitting quietly in the middle of three films that are ostensibly about politics and space battles, is how theological it is. The prequels are genuinely concerned with questions about fate and free will and the nature of prophecy, and whether a prophesied outcome can be fulfilled in a way that nobody who read the prophecy would have recognized as fulfillment. Anakin brought balance. He just did it in a way that involved burning everything down first. The opera scene itself is worth appreciating purely as a piece of filmmaking, I think. It is one of the very few moments in the prequel trilogy that feels genuinely intimate. Two people in a private space speaking quietly, without explosions or lightsabers or CGI armies. Palpatine is weaving a story, and you can watch Anakin's face as the trap closes around him in real time. The score, a piece of music John Williams wrote specifically for that sequence, an operatic chorus called Duel of the Fates, evolved into something stranger and more unsettling, sits underneath it in a way that makes the whole scene feel liturgical, like you are watching someone receive a dark gospel. That scene does something rather sophisticated with the Sith legend as well. Palpatine tells the story of Plagueis as though it were history he learned from someone else. He describes what Plagueis could do in the past tense, as though his master is entirely separate from him. And yet Palpatine is the only person who could know these details, because Plagueis would not have told anyone else, which means either Palpatine is Plagueis' apprentice, telling a story about his own master, or the story is a fabrication designed to work specifically on Anakin. The film leaves both possibilities open simultaneously, and that ambiguity is exactly right for a scene about a man being manipulated into the worst decision of his life. Right. Now for something considerably more enjoyable. In October 2015, a Reddit user called Lumpawaru posted a long, carefully written, apparently quite seriously researched theory to the Star Wars subreddit. The theory proposed with a remarkably straight face that Jar Jar Binks, the most universally mocked character in the franchise, possibly the most universally mocked character in mainstream blockbuster cinema, was actually a trained Force user who had been deliberately operating as a concealed agent throughout the prequel trilogy. The theory is called Darth Jar Jar, and it is absolutely wonderful. The central argument works like this. Jar Jar's apparent clumsiness and incompetence, the thing that forms the basis of every complaint about him, is actually a sophisticated disguise technique. Lumpao Waru pointed to a style of Chinese martial art called Zui Quan, sometimes translated as drunken fist or drunken boxing, in which practitioners deliberately appear to move without coordination in order to confuse and disorient opponents. Their movements look accidental and sloppy, but every element of the technique is precisely controlled. The theory proposes that Jar Jar's stumbling physical presence is a performance, a carefully maintained act of deliberate, appearing to be useless, that allows him to be in rooms where he otherwise would not be, and to influence events in ways nobody around him would attribute to intentional action. And then the theory points at some things in the actual films that are genuinely a bit odd when you look at them this way. Jar Jar is consistently present at critical moments. He stumbles his way into saving the Gungans in the first film while appearing to do nothing intentional. He is the one who proposes and then executes the Senate motion granting Palpatine emergency powers, the single legislative act that begins the collapse of the Republic. Before doing so, he is shown making subtle hand gestures that the theory identifies as consistent with force-based persuasion techniques used throughout the saga. He is from Naboo, the same world as Palpatine, and despite having no apparent qualifications for any of it, he is maintained in positions of proximity to power across all three films. The theory further proposes that Jar Jar was intended to be the hidden Sith Master behind the prequel trilogy, a figure operating above or alongside Palpatine, pulling strings from the shadows, but that following the catastrophic fan response to the character in The Phantom Menace, Lucas quietly abandoned those plans and reduced his role significantly, which would explain why Jar Jar essentially vanishes from meaningful involvement after Attack of the Clones, while continuing to appear in the background at important moments. What is genuinely lovely about this theory is how seriously people took it when it came out. It spread across the internet within days, generating real debate about whether the evidence was sufficient, whether the physical detail about Drunken Fist was accurate, it largely is, and whether Lucas would have been audacious enough to do something this strange with what had appeared to be a clumsy comedy character. There were semi-confirmations of a sort. Ahmed Best, who performed and voiced Jar Jar, responded to the theory with characteristic warmth, saying it felt good when the hidden meaning behind a piece of work was recognised. He mentioned in an interview that there's a lot about it that's true, and confirmed the existence of a deleted scene in which Palpatine confides specific plans to Jar Jar, a scene that would, Best said, give significant credibility to the theory if it were widely seen. Liam Neeson, at a Star Wars event, when asked directly about the Darth Jar Jar theory, simply said that Jar Jar did go to the dark side. Whether these are genuine behind-the-scenes confirmations or two warm, game actors playing along with a wonderful fan idea is, appropriately, impossible to determine. What the Darth Jar Jar theory does, regardless of its factual status, is something quietly impressive. It takes the elements of the Phantom Menace that most people had simply written off, the thing that seemed like a straightforward miscalculation, and reframes it as evidence of extraordinary sophistication. If you accept the theory even partially, every scene Jar Jar is in suddenly demands a second look. The stumble that seemed like bad writing becomes a calculated action. The Senate speech that appeared to be a narrative convenience becomes an act of dark political theatre. The clumsiness becomes a mask for something very different underneath. There are a few specific details in the theory worth mentioning for the interested listener. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence involves a scene in The Phantom Menace where Jar Jar trips and, in the process of regaining his balance, uses his foot to knock a battle droid's weapon toward another droid, destroying both. It is played as slapstick comedy, but slow the scene down, and the physics are extremely precise. The angle and force of the deflection are exactly right in a way that random stumbling almost certainly would not produce. Whether this is deliberate filmmaking or a fortunate accident of production is unknowable, but it is, to say the least, interesting to look at. There is also the matter of how Jar Jar carries himself when he's not being watched, or when the stakes are lower. In certain scenes, particularly moments where he is in the background and not the focus of the action, his posture and attentiveness shift slightly. It is subtle enough that most viewers would not notice it on a first or second watch. Fan analysis videos in the years after the theory's publication spent considerable time cataloguing these moments, and the cumulative effect is genuinely unsettling once you have been primed to see it. The one genuine structural problem with the theory, and it is a real one, worth acknowledging, is the rule of two. Sith tradition, established as law by an ancient Sith Lord called Darth Bane, holds that there can only ever be two Sith at any given time, a master and an apprentice. At the time of the Phantom Menace, the Sith are Darth Sidious and Darth Maul. If Jar Jar is a Sith collaborator operating alongside Sidious, either the rule of two has been suspended, or Jar Jar is operating in a different capacity altogether, not as a named Sith, but as something else. Fans have proposed various solutions. That Jar Jar is a Force user who never took the formal Sith title, that he operates as an agent rather than an apprentice, or that the rule of two was never quite as absolute as presented. None of these is fully satisfying, but then neither is the alternative. I find that kind of fan reinterpretation genuinely moving, actually. There is something rather human about looking at something you were told was worthless, and finding a story there that makes it worth keeping. As a postscript, the Darth Jar Jar theory became, in the years after Lumpawaru posted it, one of the most widely discussed fan theories in the history of the internet. It crossed out of the Star Wars fandom into general pop culture awareness, was covered by mainstream entertainment media, and generated a body of follow-up analysis and counter-analysis that is genuinely substantial. Lumpawaru themselves, who had written the original post in what appears to have been a burst of genuine enthusiasm, became briefly famous for it, the rare instance of a Reddit user being interviewed by actual journalists about a theory they posted to a forum at midnight. They said in a follow-up post that they had not expected any of it. The original post was meant to be a fun exercise. It turned into something that reshaped how a whole generation of Star Wars fans looked at the Phantom Menace, which is not bad for an evening's work. There is a tendency in conversations about the prequel trilogy, even now, in the era of their reappraisal, when a significant portion of people who grew up with them have come to love them genuinely, to discuss the films entirely as artifacts. To debate the dialogue, the CGI, the political plotting, the way certain characters were written, which is fair enough, but it can obscure something that is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. The Phantom Menace came out in 1999 after 16 years without a Star Wars film. The hype surrounding it was genuinely extraordinary, the kind of expectation that no film could fully survive. It was the most anticipated release in decades, and the response when it arrived was complicated. Critics and many adult fans found it disappointing, and the online criticism, which in 1999 was still relatively new as a cultural force, was immediate and very harsh. Some of it was legitimate artistic critique. Some of it was something else. Two of the performers who absorbed the most of that something else were the voice and performance artist for Jar Jar Binks, Ahmed Best, and the child actor who played young Anakin, Jake Lloyd. Lloyd was 9 years old during filming. He was selected from what Lucasfilm described as thousands of children who auditioned, and by every available account he brought genuine enthusiasm and energy to the role, qualities that George Lucas specifically said he was looking for. After the film's release, he received Golden Raspberry nominations. Classmates at school would make lightsaber sounds whenever they saw him in the corridors. He later described his school years as a living hell in a 2012 interview. He stepped away from acting not long afterwards. His mother has been careful over the years to complicate the straightforward narrative about what caused his later difficulties. She has said she shielded him considerably from the online criticism at the time, that he was largely protected from the worst of what was being written about the film. She has also said that the mental health challenges he experienced as an adult appear to have a genetic basis, separate from anything that happened in the public eye. Both things can be true simultaneously, that the bullying he described was real and harmful, and that the schizophrenia diagnosis he received would likely have come regardless. His mother's account makes that distinction clearly, and it seems worth respecting. Ahmed Best, who was an adult when the film came out and had rather more experience of how the industry worked, has spoken more directly over the years about the weight of the response. He shared a photograph in 2018 of himself with his young son at a significant location in New York, with a caption about how 20 years before, that had been the place where he almost did not continue. He was marking the distance between then and now, standing there with his child in the sunshine. He received a great deal of support when he posted it. The years since have been considerably kinder to both the character and the person who played him. The Darth Jar Jar theory rehabilitated Jar Jar in the eyes of a significant portion of the fandom, however facetiously. And Best himself found a warm homecoming to the franchise, hosting a children's game show called Jedi Temple Challenge, and then making a meaningful return appearance in the Mandalorian, in a role that a great many people found quietly moving as a piece of full-circle storytelling. He has described his relationship with Star Wars as one he has made peace with. The prequel trilogy itself, in the years since its initial reception, has undergone a genuine critical reappraisal, driven partly by a generation that grew up with the prequels as their Star Wars, and partly by a more careful examination of what Lucas was actually attempting. The tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, the fall of a democratic institution, corrupted from within, the critical landscape has shifted considerably. Hayden Christensen, who played adult Anakin and absorbed considerable criticism for his performance, said in 2023 that Lucas's choice to go back to the character as a boy to start the story with that innocence had actually given the saga something profound. George Lucas subverted our expectations and understanding of this character, he said, which, coming 25 years after the initial response, has the quality of a verdict finally arriving, none of which fully resolves what the backlash looked like in 1999. But the reappraisal is real, and the films at the centre of it have been genuinely reappraised, not just nostalgically defended. That matters. There is also something worth noting about the specific role the Clone Wars animated series played in that shift. Running from 2008 to 2014, and then revived for a final 7th season in 2020, Clone Wars went deeper into Anakin Skywalker as a character than the films had ever had time to do, filling out the warmth, the loyalty, the genuine protectiveness that made his fall genuinely tragic rather than simply dark. For a significant portion of younger viewers, Clone Wars was the version of Anakin they encountered first. They brought that fully fleshed out character back to the films with them. And when Christensen returned in live action for OHB1 Kenobi and then other projects, he received a welcome that reflected something that had been building for years across a medium most film critics do not watch. What strikes me, sitting with all of this at once, is how much the story of the prequel actors is also a story about time. Not a very long time. In the grand scheme of things, 25 years from the peak of the backlash to the full rehabilitation. But long enough that the people who were children when the prequels came out are now adults with platforms of their own. And that tends to change the conversation rather significantly. In April 2014, something happened that upset a very specific but very devoted group of Star Wars fans quite considerably, and whose feelings about it have never entirely settled even a decade later. Disney had acquired Lucasfilm in October 2012, and by 2014 they were beginning to structure what the franchise would look like going forward. The sequel trilogy was in active development. New comics were planned, new novels, and all of this new material needed to coexist without constantly bumping up against the accumulated weight of several decades of stories that had been published under various levels of official sanction across the old expanded universe. The expanded universe, or the EU, as it was universally known, had been growing since the late 1970s. By 2014, it comprised hundreds of novels, comics, video games, role-playing sourcebooks, and audiobooks, all treated with varying degrees of canonicity over the years. Some were more official than others. All of it had been carefully tracked by Lucasfilm archivists, who maintained a complex hierarchical system of canonical precedence, a document that told you whose version of events took priority when stories contradicted each other. The most beloved work in that universe was almost certainly Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, published beginning in 1991, which is sometimes credited with single-handedly reviving mainstream interest in Star Wars during the years when the franchise existed only in people's memories and on home video. Zahn introduced Grand Admiral Thrawn, a brilliantly cold Imperial military tactician who serves as the trilogy's central villain, along with several other characters who became enormously popular, most notably Mara Jade, who in the novels eventually married Luke Skywalker. For many fans who came of age reading these books, they were as Star Wars as anything in the films. Also deeply beloved was BioWare's 2003 role-playing game, Knights of the Old Republic, set thousands of years before the films, which told its own complete and thoughtfully constructed story about the nature of the Force, redemption, and the Sith, with a degree of care that rivaled anything in the theatrical releases. On April 25th, 2014, Lucasfilm announced that with a small number of exceptions, the films themselves and the Clone Wars animated series produced under Lucas's direct involvement, none of this material would be canonical in the new era. The books, the games, the comics, all of it was being moved under a new label, Legends. The announcement was careful to emphasize that nothing was being erased or destroyed. The Legends label was intended to signal that these were stories that happened in a Star Wars universe, just not necessarily the one the new films would inhabit. The creative teams working on new material would have full access to everything that had been built. Characters could be reintroduced. Concepts could be carried forward. For a significant number of EU fans, this was cold comfort. They had spent years, sometimes decades, reading hundreds of thousands of pages of interconnected storytelling, storylines that spanned whole family trees, that dealt with the consequences of the original trilogy, that gave Luke and Han and Leia full lives beyond Return of the Jedi. Being told that these things had not happened in any meaningful canonical sense was a genuine loss. The emotional investment in those stories was real and considerable. And then a funny thing happened over the years that followed. The new canon started quietly pulling things back in. Thrawn himself was introduced into the canonical timeline through the animated series Rebels, still a Chiss military genius, still called Thrawn, still commanding the same ship with the same name, still using art as his primary tool for understanding people. Ahsoka Tano, who had originated in the Clone Wars series, preserved in the new canon, eventually got her own live-action series. Concepts from Knights of the Old Republic began appearing in reference material and canon comics. Kor Usant, which Zahn had invented, was already in the prequel films. There is a quiet irony in all of this that I quite enjoy. When the Legends announcement came out, it was framed as a clean break, the old material set aside so that new stories could move freely. What actually happened was a decade of the new canon steadily, selectively absorbing the things from the old canon that people loved most. The break was real. The abandonment was not quite. For what it is worth, the specific loss that EU fans most consistently mention is not Thrawn, who came back, but Mara Jade. Luke Skywalker's wife in the novels, introduced by Zahn as a former Emperor's hand, who becomes one of the most compelling characters in the EU across many books, has not reappeared in the new canon. There have been what some fans interpret as nods and possible setups. A throwaway detail here, a character type there, but nothing confirmed. She remains the most visible absence in the new timeline, and she comes up in conversation regularly enough that it seems fair to include her here. The emotional weight of the Legends reclassification was also about something more abstract than specific characters. For the fans who had spent years reading the EU, tracking continuity across hundreds of books, following storylines that unfolded over decades of publication history, the transition was a bit like discovering that the language you had been fluent in was no longer being spoken anywhere official. The skills and knowledge and investment did not disappear, but the conversation had moved somewhere. They were not automatically included. That is a particular kind of dislocation, and it deserves a note. There is also a gentle footnote. The Legends reclassification technically removed the Star Wars Holiday Special from canonical status as well. Nobody wrote a petition about that one. Here is a piece of Star Wars lore that I find quietly delightful, and that most people who love the franchise have never heard of. During the filming of Revenge of the Sith, on what was apparently his first day working on the production, animation director Rob Coleman arrived on set, and George Lucas told him something about the whole saga that he described as his ultimate framing device. The entire story of Star Wars, all of it, the Republic and the Empire, and the Rebellion, and everything that came before and after, is being recounted approximately 100 years after the events of Return of the Jedi Order by R2-D2. The little astromech droid is telling the story to the keeper of a document called the Journal of the Wills, a kind of sacred historical record of galactic events. What we are watching in this framing is R2's memory of everything that happened. This was reported in 2014 in a book called How Star Wars Conquered the Universe by the journalist Chris Taylor, who had spoken to Coleman about it. And once you hear it, it makes a kind of lovely sense. Think about it for a moment. R2-D2 is present in every single film in the Skywalker saga. He is there from before ANN, Kin Skywalker's birth through to the defeat of the resurrected Emperor in The Rise of Skywalker. He is one of the very few characters who witnesses the full span of events. And unlike most of the others who survive that long, he never has his memory wiped. C-3P, his closest companion across all 9 films, has his memory cleared at the end of Revenge of the Sith, which is why he has no idea who Owen and Beru Lars are when he meets them in A New Hope, despite the fact that Anakin built him, and Anakin's stepbrother is Owen. R2 retains everything. He knows where all the bodies are buried, metaphorically and occasionally literally. And in a saga absolutely full of characters making catastrophic mistakes, who misjudge situations, who are deceived, who act from fear or love, and bring ruin upon themselves, R2 is consistently, remarkably right. His plans work. His interventions are well timed. He appears from the outside to have a much clearer picture of what is actually happening than most of the people around him. In a story about how flawed and short-sighted even the wisest beings can be, the small droid who cannot even form words beeps and whistles his way through every disaster, with something that looks quite a lot like competence. If he is the narrator, that makes sense. He has already seen how it all turns out. The Journal of the Wills is a concept that goes back to the very origins of Star Wars. Lucas's earliest screenplay drafts from the early 1970s opened with the journal as a framing device, a sacred text that would connect the events of the galaxy far, far away to the reader's present world, somewhat in the tradition of old adventure stories presented as discovered manuscripts or ancient chronicles. That original framing was cut before A New Hope was made, but Lucas clearly never entirely let go of the idea. In his treatment for a sequel trilogy, the one Disney did not use, he had planned to explore the microbiotic world of the Force and the beings he called the Wills more directly. That material was set aside when the new creative team went in a different direction, but the image of the journal itself, and of R2 as the one telling the whole story, persisted in his private thinking about what the saga was. What I find most resonant about this framing is something quite simple. The events of Star Wars are extraordinary and frequently very dark, full of loss and betrayal, and things going badly wrong on a civilizational scale. But they are being remembered and narrated by a small, loyal, indestructible little droid who was there for all of it, who apparently understood it better than most of the people living through it, and who survived to the other side. That is, in its quiet way, a rather hopeful framing for the whole thing. It also recontextualizes a small detail in The Force Awakens that I have always liked. R2-D2 spends most of that film in a kind of dormant state, apparently shut down and unresponsive. He wakes up at the very end, when he is needed, having apparently been in possession of the missing piece of the map to Luke Skywalker the entire time. The film implies he was simply grieving, in some fashion, for the absence of Luke. But if R2 is the narrator, there is another possible reading. He knew how the story went from here, and he was waiting for the right moment to give it a push. The Wills themselves are worth a brief note. In Lucas's very first screenplay draft, written in 1973, before the film had been formally commissioned, the Journal of the Wills was an actual framing document, a prologue that explicitly presented the story as a record from this sacred archive. This is the story of Mace Windu, it began, in a version of events almost entirely different from what eventually became A New Hope. The Wills were envisioned as beings of enormous spiritual power who maintained the cosmic record. Lucas cut the framing device before the script was substantially developed, but the concept clearly remained in his thinking for 40 years. What he told Rob Coleman on the Revenge of the Sith set suggests he had quietly been carrying the idea the entire time, waiting for the right place to put it. The fact that it has never been officially confirmed or built into a film or series, that it remains this private, slightly mythological detail shared on a film set and recorded in a book, gives it a quality that official canon, with all its merchandising and wiki entries, does not quite produce. It is a story about a story, told in passing. That feels appropriate, somehow. The Last Jedi arrived in cinemas in December 2017 and divided Star Wars fandom in a way no entry in the franchise had managed since the first prequel. In some respects, it was the most discussed film of that year. In other respects, it was the beginning of a period that was genuinely difficult for a lot of people involved. Rian Johnson, who wrote and directed it, made a Star Wars film that was genuinely interested in subverting expectations. Not in a cheap or cynical way, but in a way that felt like actual creative conviction. Where you expected the film to go, it very often did not. The mystery established in The Force Awakens about Rey's parentage, who her family was, why she had this extraordinary connection to the Force, was answered in The Last Jedi with a choice that surprised almost everyone. Her parents were ordinary people, nobody special, who sold her for drinking money and died in a pauper's grave somewhere. She did not come from anything. She came from nothing, and that turned out to be enough. For a significant portion of the audience, this was exactly right. For another portion, it felt like a betrayal, either of the mystery itself or of what they thought Star Wars should be about. The film also made structural choices that generated real debate on their own merits, separate from all the cultural noise around it. The Holdo maneuver, The sequence where Vice Admiral Holdo flies a cruiser into hyperspace directly through the middle of an enemy fleet, destroying it, is one of the most visually striking moments in the entire franchise, presented in near-complete silence in a way Johnson clearly thought about carefully. But it raised a question that the film did not fully answer. If this works, why has no one ever done it before? And why would any military conflict in this universe require anything other than unmanned ships and hyperdrives? Supplementary material offered explanations involving specific shield configurations. A fair number of people remained unconvinced. Luke Skywalker's characterization generated the sharpest argument of all. Mark Hamill has been candid in interviews about the fact that his initial response to what the film asked of Luke, a broken, disillusioned old man who had gone into hiding after briefly considering killing his sleeping nephew, did not feel right to him. He's also been careful to say, in the same breath, that he ultimately trusted Johnson's vision and that he believes it works. The film gives Luke a complete arc. He does return to himself. He does act heroically and meaningfully. But the middle portion was genuinely difficult for viewers who had waited a long time to see Luke Skywalker again. What is not really debatable, and what I think is important to sit with honestly, is what happened to Kelly Marie Tran. Tran played Rose Tycho, a resistance technician who partners with Finn on a significant subplot. She was the first woman of colour to have a lead role in a Star Wars film, a milestone that was genuinely notable and genuinely noted at the time. In the months after the film's release, she became the target of sustained online harassment, racist and sexist in character, targeting both her performance and her presence in the franchise at all. Her character's page on the Star Wars fan wiki was edited anonymously to include racist language. She received continuous abuse about her appearance and her ethnicity. In June 2018, she deleted all of her Instagram posts. When she later wrote about the experience in a piece for the New York Times, she was direct about what had happened to her thinking during that period, that she had started to believe the things people were saying, that the cruelty had found its way into how she thought about herself. That is not a minor thing. That is a real account of what sustained, targeted abuse can do to a person. One analysis of the campaign at the time estimated that a significant proportion of the attacking accounts were bots or coordinated inauthentic sources rather than genuine film viewers, which does not absolve the actual people who participated, but it does complicate the question of how representative the online response was of what most people actually thought about the film. Rian Johnson responded publicly, drawing a clear line between having critical opinions about a film and driving a performer off social media, calling it, with some precision, disingenuous bullshit to conflate the two. Mark Hamill posted a photograph with Tran. Tran went to therapy, said it helped, and continued working. The film itself, years on, remains genuinely divisive in a way that has softened but not resolved. People still disagree about it, and the disagreements are often sincere and interesting. What seems clear, in retrospect, is that it was ambitious in ways that some of its audience were not ready for, and that the energy of that gap found some very bad places to go. One element of the film that generated its own specific debate, separate from all the cultural noise, is the Canto Bight sequence. The Casino Planet subplot where Finn and Rose travel to find a code breaker, experience the decadence of war profiteers, and ultimately fail in their mission. The failure is the point. Johnson was explicitly writing a film where the plans do not work, where sacrifice does not automatically produce victory, where moral seriousness does not guarantee success. Critics who found the sequence too long or tonally inconsistent were not wrong about the length. Critics who pointed out that it was doing something thematically deliberate were also not wrong. It sits in that uncomfortable space where two accurate assessments of the same material lead to completely opposite conclusions about whether the film is working, which is either a mark of interesting filmmaking or a sign that something has gone wrong, depending on your temperament. Johnson has said, in multiple interviews over the years, that he made exactly the film he intended to make, and that he has no regrets about it. He has also been magnanimous about the rise of Skywalker taking the story in a different direction, saying clearly that a different director's different creative choices are not an attack on what he did. That is a gracious position to maintain, and he has maintained it consistently. The story of Solo. A Star Wars story is one that can be read a few different ways depending on who you ask, and the accounts from people who were there do not all agree on the details. What is not disputed is the sequence of events, which is extraordinary even by the standards of troubled productions. The film was announced as part of the new Disney-era anthology strand, standalone films set in the Star Wars universe, outside the main Skywalker storyline. The directors hired were Phil Lord and Christopher Miller, who had made the Lego Movie and the Jump Street films, and who had a particular reputation for quick, tonally nimble comedies that worked on multiple registers simultaneously. The script was by Lawrence Kasdan, who had written The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, and his son Jonathan. On paper, this sounded like a combination of interesting ingredients. Filming began in January 2017. Things started going wrong fairly quickly, though exactly why depends somewhat on whose account you're reading. Lord and Miller had an approach to filmmaking that centered on experimentation and improvisation, shooting scenes from many angles, encouraging actors to try things that were not in the script, accumulating material, and working out in the edit what the film wanted to be. This method had served them very well on previous projects, but it appears not to have meshed with what Lucasfilm and Lawrence Kasdan wanted for the film. The script was the script, and the sense from the production side was that the film being shot was not the film that had been planned. In June 2017, after approximately 3/4 of principal photography had been completed, Lord and Miller departed the project. Ron Howard, who had directed Lucasfilm's fantasy film Willow in 1988, and who had a long personal connection to George Lucas, going back to American Graffiti in 1973, was brought in to complete it. Howard reviewed existing footage, identified what needed to change, and then reshot somewhere over 70% of the film. An actor in a significant supporting role, Michael K. Williams, was unavailable for the reshoots due to other commitments. His character was redesigned and recast with Paul Bettany. The budget, already substantial, expanded to somewhere between $275 and $300 million. The film opened on the 25th of May 2018, the anniversary of A New Hope's original release, deliberately against Avengers. Infinity War, which had opened 3 weeks earlier and was still drawing enormous audiences, and Deadpool 2, which had opened the previous week. It made approximately $393 million worldwide, becoming the first Star Wars film in the franchise's history to lose money at the box office. Ron Howard, speaking about it afterwards, said that when he came in and looked at the existing footage, he could see what was bothering Lucasfilm. There was a studio that liked the script the way it was and wanted a Star Wars movie, but there was a disconnect early on tonally. He described Lord and Miller as incredibly gracious throughout the transition process and said their fingerprints were all over the finished film regardless, which is perhaps the most diplomatically complete account of a difficult situation that I have ever read. Lord and Miller themselves have said in the years since that they felt deeply misunderstood at the time, though they have also come to view the experience with some perspective. They're clearly still making things they love, and the situation does not appear to have defined them in any lasting professional sense. The box office result had significant consequences for the franchise's direction. Iger slowed the film slate considerably. A planned Boba Fett standalone film was quietly set aside. That creative energy eventually became The Man du Hlor-i-Un as a streaming series, which turned out rather well. A planned OHB1 K-B film, which had been in development with a director attached, was similarly reshaped into a Disney Plus miniseries. The model of annual Star Wars theatrical releases was effectively retired. The film itself, separate from its production history, holds up reasonably well. Alden Ehrenreich brings genuine warmth and charisma to the role, playing Han Solo when everyone in the audience knows Harrison Ford is the definitive version is an almost impossibly difficult brief, and he handles it with more grace than the circumstances probably deserved. Donald Glover as Lando Calrissian is, by wide consensus, simply very good. The story covers ground that did not necessarily need covering, and the tonal seams from the director change are occasionally visible. But as Star Wars films go, it is a perfectly watchable one, and its box office fate says more about the circumstances of its release than about the film on its own terms. There is a small warm footnote. During the reshoots, George Lucas visited the set, intending a brief social call, and ended up staying for 5 hours offering advice on a scene, which is, depending on how you look at it, either touching or slightly complicated. A note on Alden Ehrenreich specifically, because I think he deserves one. Playing Han Solo when Harrison Ford exists is an absurd brief. There is no version of it that is going to satisfy everyone, and the critical response to his performance, divided at the time between people who found him charming and people who found him insufficient, has settled, on balance, in his favour in the years since. He brought something to the role that was entirely his own, a kind of eager, stumbling charm that felt different from Ford's laconic cool, but was recognisably the same person in a younger guise. That is actually a quite difficult thing to do, and he did it without the benefit of a film that was working around him in every respect. Donald Glover's Lando Calrissian is, I will say this simply, one of the most fully realised performances in any Star Wars film. He makes Lando feel like someone with an entire life happening off-screen, someone with history and contradictions and a quality of warmth that makes you understand immediately why everyone who meets him ends up both liking him and not quite trusting him. Billy D. Williams played Lando with enormous charm in the original trilogy. Glover found something additional in the character. The conversations about whether Lando should get a series of his own have been happening since 2018, and they are not unreasonable conversations to be having. The Rise of Skywalker arrived in December 2019 as the final chapter of the Skywalker saga, a film carrying the weight of 9 installments, more than 40 years of storytelling, and a fandom still not quite settled from everything that had happened around The Last Jedi. It had a great deal to accomplish and relatively little time in which to do it. Within the first few minutes, Poe Dameron delivers what has since become one of the most quoted lines in recent blockbuster history. Somehow, Palpatine returned. And then the film proceeds from that point, with the Emperor established as the central villain of a story in which he had appeared, speaking and present in no part of the previous 2 films. The reaction to this was, to put it diplomatically, complicated. On one level, Palpatine returning is not inherently an absurd idea. The original expanded universe, the Legends material we talked about in Section 8, had explored exactly this scenario in a comic series called Dark Empire from the early 1990s, where Palpatine came back in a cloned body, commanding a vast new fleet. The concept of Sith finding ways to cheat death had been part of the mythology since at least the prequel era, when Plagueis' experiments were introduced and when Darth Maul returned despite having been cut in half. And J.J. Abrams has said that he discussed the idea with Lucas, who approved of it, which is consistent with Lucas's long-standing interest in those themes. The problem that most critics identified was not the fact of Palpatine's return, it was that his return was announced in the film's opening moments, with no build-up in either of the 2 preceding films, and with a single line of dialogue that essentially acknowledged its own insufficiency and then moved on. The word somehow is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. It is the film telling you, in the voice of one of its own characters, that the explanation is not coming, and then asking you to proceed anyway. Oscar Isaac, who plays Poe, has since been candid about the origin of the line. He has confirmed it was added in reshoots, after an original attempt at an explanation was judged to be too vague. The decision was apparently made that acknowledging the gap was preferable to attempting to fill it inadequately, which is defensible reasoning, though the result is a line that functions as something close to its own parody, widely clipped, widely memed, and now permanently associated with a particular kind of narrative shortcut. The film also made a choice that directly reversed the Last Jedi's answer to the Rey parentage question. Having been told in 2017 that her parents were nobody, ordinary people, with no particular significance, which Johnson had intended as a thematically meaningful statement, audiences were now told that Rey was Palpatine's granddaughter. The whiplash between these two answers generated a great deal of discussion about whether the sequel trilogy had any coherent creative direction, or whether the third film was being written specifically in response to the negative reaction to the second, rather than as a continuation of an existing plan. The sequel trilogy's box office arc told its own story. The Force Awakens made over $2 billion. The Last Jedi made a little over $1.5 billion. The Rise of Skywalker made a little over $1 billion. Each film made less than the one before it, though all of them are very large numbers in absolute terms, and The Rise of Skywalker is not meaningfully a box office failure. It is more of a trajectory. In the years since, Lucasfilm has done considerable work in comics and animated series to fill in the gaps the film left open. The Bad Batch explored the early stages of what Palpatine had been doing on Exegol in the years between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. Various other properties added context to the cloning program and the Sith fleet. Whether this retroactive world building fully satisfies the people who felt the film had not done the work in real time is a question each viewer has to answer for themselves. What is worth saying, because the critical conversation around the Rise of Skywalker sometimes flattens into a simple verdict, is that the film has genuine strengths. Adam Driver's work across the entire trilogy is, by wide agreement, one of its most valuable creative achievements, and this film gives him a complete arc. Carrie Fisher's final appearance, assembled from unused footage in a way that required real delicacy and technical skill, has a quiet dignity to it. Some of the action sequences are extraordinarily made. John Williams, composing his final Star Wars score, does things to the emotional weight of scenes that the images alone would not manage. It is a film that tried hard to end something well and did not quite manage it, in the view of many people who watched it. But trying hard to end something well is not nothing. One thing The Rise of Skywalker did accomplish, regardless of how you feel about the story choices, was bringing a certain kind of emotional sincerity to its ending. The final sequence on Tatooine, Rey burying Luke and Leia's lightsabers at the moisture farm, where it all began, looking out at a binary sunset in a clear echo of the most iconic shot in the franchise, is an unambiguous statement about what Star Wars is at its core. That binary sunset in A New Hope is about longing, about a young person staring out at the universe they have not yet been allowed to enter. In The Rise of Skywalker, looking at the same two suns after everything that has happened, it becomes something different, a moment of arrival rather than longing. Whether the journey that preceded it earned that arrival is the question the film's critics are still asking, but the intention of the shot is unmistakable, and in its way, genuinely lovely. The Rise of Skywalker is also, for what it is worth, the film where John Williams quoted the binary sunset theme in the score at that precise moment. He had been composing Star Wars music since 1977. That he chose to end his final Star Wars score on that specific melodic line, at that specific moment in the story, is either a piece of elegant craftsmanship, or a sentimental flourish, or both? I know which I think it is. The behind-the-scenes account of how the film's script was developed is, in itself, a story of enormous pressure and limited time. J.J. Abrams and Chris Terrio wrote under a compressed deadline, following Colin Trevorrow's departure from the director's chair in 2017. Trevorrow had developed a version of the script, eventually leaked in 2020, under the title Duel of the Fates, that took a markedly different approach. In his version, there is no Palpatine. Rey and Kylo Ren's conflict plays out without an external dark force orchestrating it, and the resolution is arguably more intimate, though also considerably stranger in some of its specific choices. What would have been on screen is impossible to know, and counterfactual filmmaking is a notoriously tricky game. But the fact that two substantially different third films were developed for the same trilogy, and that the fandom has since extensively debated which approach was better, suggests something about the degree of creative uncertainty that surrounded the sequel trilogy's final chapter from the beginning. The Disney Plus era of Star Wars has produced some genuinely remarkable television. The Mandalorian, particularly its first 2 seasons, brought the franchise to a new audience, while giving longtime fans exactly the kind of lived-in, gritty corner of the galaxy they had always wanted to see. Or is, I will say this plainly, one of the finest pieces of political drama the Star Wars universe has ever produced. Patient and character-driven and interested in things the films rarely had time for. Obi-Wan Kenobi gave a generation the reunion they had been waiting for. The skeleton crew was considerably better than most people expected, and there is now a series called Maul, Shadow Lord, which I gather is doing quite well. It is worth saying something specific about what made the Mandalorian land so effectively, because it is relevant to understanding why some of the subsequent shows landed harder than others. The series committed almost entirely to mood and world building, leaning into the Western and samurai genre influences that had always been present in Lucas's original Star Wars, but that big-budget space opera had gradually squeezed out. It was patient. It liked silence. It understood that a small child in a floating pram was one of the most effective images of innocence the franchise had ever produced, and it trusted that image to do work without constantly explaining it. In the context of a franchise that had spent years under considerable pressure to deliver big, loud, emotionally complex storylines, a show that was essentially about a man and a baby travelling through interesting landscapes felt almost radical. Or deserves its own note, because it is the most unusual thing Disney has produced under the Star Wars banner. Set before Rogue One, it follows Cass Eonand across the years of his radicalization, his gradual recruitment into active rebellion against the Empire. It is not a fun show in the traditional sense. It is rigorous and slow and interested in bureaucracy and resistance, and the ordinary human cost of living under authoritarianism. The first season has been described, by people who have thought carefully about the medium, as one of the best single seasons of television in recent years, regardless of franchise. It was not the Star Wars most people expected. It was better than most of them anticipated. It has also been a period defined, to an uncomfortable degree, by 2 specific controversies that had less to do with the quality of the storytelling than with the broader cultural temperature of the moment they arrived in. The first concerns Gina Carano, who played Cara Dune in the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian. Cara Dune was a former Rebel Alliance shock trooper turned lawkeeper on a frontier planet, a fan favourite almost immediately, a character who used practical skill and physical presence rather than force abilities, and someone Lucasfilm had, by multiple accounts, significant plans for. A spin-off called Rangers of the New Republic had reportedly been in development with Carano at the centre of it. In September 2020, she changed her social media bio to include the phrase beep/bop/boop, which a number of people interpreted as mockery of the practice of listing gender pronouns in public profiles. She subsequently said she had meant it as an R2-D2 reference, which is at least a creative explanation. She also posted material over the following months relating to mask wearing during the pandemic and making claims about the 2020 election. None of this resulted in immediate action from Lucasfilm. Then in February 2021, she reshared a post on Instagram that compared the situation of conservatives in modern America to the persecution of Jewish people under the Nazis. The hashtag #FireGina Carano trended almost immediately. That same day, Lucasfilm released a statement confirming she was not currently employed by them and there were no plans for that to change, citing posts that denigrated people based on their cultural and religious identities. Her talent agency dropped her on the same day. Carano filed a lawsuit against Disney and Lucasfilm in 2024, with her legal costs reportedly supported by Elon Musk, arguing wrongful termination and discrimination based on her political views. The case went through the courts and settled in August 2025, with terms not publicly disclosed. A Lucasfilm statement released alongside the settlement said she'd been well respected by her directors, co-stars, and staff, and expressed an interest in future collaboration, which generated its own round of discussion. The second situation is somewhat different and, I think, more complicated to read fairly. The Acolyte was a Star Wars series created by Leslie Headland, who had previously made the Russian Doll series, set approximately 100 years before The Phantom Menace, in a part of the Star Wars timeline that had been explored in novels but never on screen. It followed twin sisters and a mysterious masked figure through a story about the hidden, early workings of dark side forces. The cast was diverse, the production design was genuinely exceptional, and the creative ambitions were clear and specific. It was cancelled in August 2024, approximately 1 month after its 8-episode first season ended on a cliffhanger. Disney and Lucasfilm cited cost concerns. The budget has been reported at approximately $230 million, and viewership that had not met the threshold for renewal. The show received a 78% approval rating from critics. It received an 18% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. A gap of 60 points between those two numbers is not the signature of a show that genuinely divided viewers with opposing sincere opinions. It is, as many observers noted at the time, the characteristic pattern of a coordinated review bombing campaign. Amandla Stenberg, one of the leads, released a song responding to what she described as intolerable racist harassment. Lee Jung-jae said in interviews that the comments about the casting had hurt him personally and that he hoped racism would end someday, even though it's going to be hard. Headland herself, in a 2025 interview, described the people behind the campaign with some precision. Some of them she had even supported financially in the past. She made clear she knew exactly who they were. The business case for cancellation was real as well. The viewership pattern was severe, a catastrophic drop from the opening episodes to the finale, which by available data was the lowest viewed Star Wars finale to that point. Headland acknowledged both the viewership and the creative factors when discussing it, saying she was not surprised by the decision, only by how swift and public it was. The odd coda to the story, which I find genuinely interesting, is what has happened since. The Acolyte accumulated 2.7 billion viewing minutes across 2024, making it the second most watched show on Disney Plus for the full year. And in 2026, with no new episodes, no promotional campaign, and no announcement of any revival, it quietly reappeared on the platform's domestic most watched charts. People were finding their way back to it on their own. What that means for the argument about whether the show had an audience is, depending on your position, either very clear or still complicated. Headland has said she has no regrets. She loved making the show. She remains an avowed Star Wars fan. The story threads she had planned for a second season, including the full introduction of Darth Plagueis, who appeared at the very end of the first, remain unresolved. Which is, honestly, the kind of ending that tends to keep people coming back to look at something one more time. What I think is genuinely worth mourning about the Acolyte's cancellation, separate from any argument about the viewing figures or the budget, is what it was trying to do creatively. The show was set in a period of Star Wars history that had never been dramatized, a High Republic era where the Jedi were at the height of their institutional power, before any of the cracks that we see in the prequel trilogy had become visible, which meant it could explore questions about Jedi complacency, about the cost of institutional certainty, about whether an organization that genuinely believes it represents good can do harm while believing itself righteous. Those are interesting questions, and they were being asked seriously and with intention. The fact that they were being asked in the context of a show that attracted a coordinated campaign to tank its audience score before most people had watched a single episode is, on balance, a fairly dismal thing to reflect on. The viewing figures the show accumulated in 2024 belong to it regardless. So does Amandla Stenberg's performance in the dual role of the twin sisters, which is considerably more technically demanding than it looks, and which she carries with a quality that a lot of shows would be glad to have as a lead. The show exists. It is on the platform. People keep finding it. So, a 1978 variety special with Wookiees and Jefferson Starship, a cantina scene edited 4 times, a dinner party joke that became the most famous plot twist in cinema, microscopic organisms that started a significant argument, a Gungan who might have been pulling strings all along, the most beloved characters in the galaxy, and the very complicated question of what happens to the people who play them. There is a thread running through all of it, and I think it is the same thread that George Lucas tried to put into words, not particularly elegantly, in December 2015, sitting down with the interviewer Charlie Rose shortly after The Force Awakens had opened. Lucas had spent years developing his own plans for a third trilogy. He had treatments written. He had brought them to Disney when he sold Lucasfilm in 2012 for approximately $4 billion, half in cash and half in Disney stock. Disney, who had paid a considerable sum for the right to make their own decisions, had gone in a different direction. And sitting there with Rose, talking about the franchise he had created and built his adult life around, Lucas said that he had sold his characters to white slavers, a phrase he apologized for immediately afterwards, saying it was an inappropriate analogy. He then described the films as his kids, which is a much cleaner phrase and probably the truer one. In a later conversation with the author Paul Duncan, he described the whole process as very, very painful, like a breakup, like handing your kids over to the wrong people, which is, under the diplomatic language, a remarkably unguarded thing for a billionaire to say about a business transaction. What that tells you, what all of this tells you, the holiday special, and the re-edits, and the theories, and the EU, and the petitions, and the review campaigns, and every argument that has ever happened in a Star Wars comment section, is that this franchise is one of the rare things that people feel a genuine proprietary relationship with, regardless of whether they have any legal or creative claim to it. The fans feel it belongs to them because they grew up with it, because it is woven into how they understood good and evil and courage and sacrifice when they were small. Lucas felt it belonged to him because he made it, because it came out of something personal, his interest in mythology and family, and how stories about fathers and sons and redemption actually work in a deep structural sense. And the people at Disney feel it belongs to them because they paid $4 billion for it. None of these positions is entirely wrong, and that is, I think, why the arguments never fully stop. You cannot settle a question of ownership when the thing being owned is primarily an emotional experience. You can hold the rights to it, or write the new scripts for it, or have grown up watching it on Saturday mornings. None of those things transfer the feeling of it, and the feeling is what everyone is actually arguing about. The theories persist for the same reason. Darth Jar Jar, R2-D2 as the hidden narrator, the question of Anakin's true origin, these are all ways of staying inside the story, of finding more in it than is officially there, of refusing to let it be finished. A story that people keep theorizing about and arguing over is a story that has not been let go of. And Star Wars, whatever you think of any particular chapter of it, has not been let go of by a very large number of people for a very long time. There is also something worth noting about where we are in 2026. The Mandalorian and Grogu is scheduled for release later this year, the first Star Wars theatrical film in nearly 7 years. That gap is the longest the franchise has gone without a cinema release since before The Phantom Menace. Whatever that film turns out to be, it will arrive into a fandom that has had a long time to think about what it wants from a theatrical Star Wars experience, and a long time to argue about whether those expectations are reasonable. The arguments will almost certainly continue after it opens. That is, in a way, as much a part of Star Wars as anything else. The backlash, the real ugly side of it, the part that drove people off social media and into therapy, is what happens when that feeling curdles, when the sense of ownership becomes possessive in a way that forgets the people standing at the centre of it are human beings doing jobs they chose because they loved the thing. The roots of it are the same roots. The intensity is genuine, even when it goes somewhere it should not. I find that, on balance, still moving, even when the fandom is exhausting, even when watching it from the outside is disheartening. The root of it, the thing that makes someone spend weeks writing a theory about a CGI frog alien, or sign a petition asking for a single song to be played on television, or spend years restoring a film to a version that never existed on any official format. That root is real. It is, at its core, a kind of love. Strange, complicated, sometimes very badly expressed, but love all the same. Star Wars as a franchise has now been in continuous existence for nearly 50 years. The people who were children when A New Hope opened in 1977 are now in their 50s and 60s. The people who were children when The Phantom Menace came out are in their 30s. The people who grew up with Clone Wars and The Mandalorian are still in their 20s. Each generation has its own Star Wars, its own entry point, its own version of the thing it loves. That the arguments continue is partly because there are so many versions of what Star Wars is supposed to be, and partly because each version belongs genuinely to the people who grew up with it.